go ahead and get started, everybody. Good morning. My name is Matt Cook. I'm the director of the Center for Healthy Churches. I'd like to welcome you to the Changing Church webinar. This webinar is designed and was created to help ministers and congregations ask and answer the adaptive questions that all those of us who love the church and serve the church are asking in this very challenging, creative, generative, frustrating moment in which we find ourselves in American Christianity. That we do that in a lot of different ways, but today and next week we're kind of getting all the way up to 25,000 foot level in some ways. We have all-star panels this week and next week of seasoned and wise observers of the church who are going to help us ask some big picture questions. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to look back into 2022, and we're going to pay attention to some things. I'm going to ask our panel to pay attention to some things from their observation points and give us some answers to some various questions. So we're excited about that. I'd like to introduce our panel to you this morning. My friend Eileen Campbell Reid is a visiting associate professor of pastoral theology and care at Union Seminary in New York. She is, among other things, the founder and host of the 3-Minute Ministry Mentor. That's not easy to say fast, by the way, Eileen. She's the author of several books. She has been a long time observer, commentator on the role of women in ministry. And she's also done a lot of work around the church responding to the pandemic. And Eileen's going to actually have some things to share with us as part of that work on her effort. So Eileen, great to have you with us this morning. Mike Hunter is very involved, long-term minister in the Disciples of Christ tradition in Texas, has served congregations in Lufkin, Tyler, and Midland, Texas, and is wrapping up a tenure as, and I think it's transitional interim minister, Mike, did I get the title right? At a church in Houston. So, but there's even more than that Mike has been involved in. Mike's been very involved in helping churches ask and answer really good questions administratively and financially, does some really creative work there. So Mike, it's good to have you on. Mike's also one of our team at the Center for Healthy Churches. And then last but not least, Jessica Tate is a Presbyterian minister living in Washington, D.C., trained leadership coach. She was the founding director of Next Church. So if you know Presbyterian Life, that tells you a lot of wonderful things right there. And if you don't know Presbyterian Life, you ought to know it. That Next Church is a really, really interesting, we used to use the term emerging, and I'm not sure that's exactly the term that you would use, Jessica, to describe that. And maybe gives the wrong connotation, but a lot of creative things emerged out of Next Church and continue to emerge out of Next Church. Prior to serving Next Church, she was associate pastor of Fairfax Presbyterian Church in Northern Virginia, and you're on staff at Georgetown Presbyterian. Is that right, Jessica?
Yep, associate pastor here now.
Yeah. So our panel, like hats galore, if they put on all their hats, their heads would be covered in hats this morning. So it's good to have all of you on with us this morning. So for everybody else, before I jump in, let me thank all of our partners that help make this webinar a reality. We are grateful for the good work of the Church Network, for the Gardner Webb Divinity School, for Baptist News Global, for the Presbyterian Foundation, for the Lake Institute for Faith and Giving, for Truett Seminary and the Truett Church Network, for New Matrix, and then my organization, the Center for Healthy Churches, all of whom kind of come together to help make this webinar a reality. We're grateful for that partnership. So, with all of those introductions out of the way, let's jump in and let's go backwards a little bit. Let's hit rewind all the way back to the beginning of this year. I remember thinking a year ago when we did this almost exact same topic in December, all right, woohoo, we're finally going to be out of this pandemic mess and things are going to get back to normal and calm down. And I got to tell you, I don't think of 2022 as a calm and easy, back to normal kind of year. I bet y'all don't either in a lot of ways. I want to give you an opportunity, though, to kind of talk about the past year from your own vantage points. So, Jessica, I'm going to start with you, all right? You get to go first. And and go wherever your brain takes you, wherever your experience takes you. And I said, what's the most surprising thing for you and your vantage point, or perhaps in the context, the larger network in which you do ministry? What would you say is the most surprising thing about this past year for you related to the church?
Yeah, thanks for the invitation to be here. I think the thing that there's two things that come to mind for me. One is something I heard Chris Coble from the Lilly Endowment say sometime during the pandemic, that the surprising thing isn't that our churches are dying because of all this disruption. The surprising thing is that we're still here. And I think that is something that there has been so much change, so much disruption, so much pivoting, that good on us. We're still here. And in some places doing really vibrant work right now, in many places doing really vibrant work right now. And I think the other thing, so one of the hats I wear is working with the Presbyterian Foundation and gathering clergy who are Gen X and younger for professional development and connection. And one of the things I've been noticing in that work is just the profound isolation that pastors are feeling and the profound exhaustion. And really, particularly the younger generations, just because that's who I'm connecting to more often, it may be true beyond that, but asking some really kind of existential questions about the purpose of the church and really, what are we even trying to do? Are we effective at all? Is this, what are we doing here? And people aren't hopeless in asking those questions,
right?
But just asking the big questions.
And in some ways, we're going to get down this a little bit later, but I didn't want to lose the thread. Are they in the younger generation that you're working with, are they starting to find some answers to those questions? What are we doing here? Or are they still very much in the wrestling mode, or some of both?
I would say both. I think the exhaustion and the sense of isolation is being a stumbling block to get to some creative answers. So I think there's a desire and a real honest wrestling, and then an exhaustion and trying to just figure out what's the next pivot we've got to do this week.
Yeah. Mike, what about you? From your perspective and your vantage point, how would you answer that question? The most surprising thing from this past year related to the church?
Well, context here is that I was asked to come be a part of an interim transitional. So they had some issues at the end of a long pastorate, and it had quite a loss of folks over conflict in the midst of COVID. And quite frankly, had this campus not had a school, this church would have been among the casualties to closure. The second influence over is we are across the street from Rice University. We are an open and affirming congregation, but we are 4 to 5 blocks from the medical center complex in Houston, MD Anderson, and all those kind of things. And many of our students in our school, their parents are in the medical profession. Coupled with that is Houston was one of the hottest areas for COVID, one of the most restrictive in Texas. And add another layer of that because of the protocol in the medical complex. So I've had to wade through so many layers, unlike anything else in my career. The second piece that's been surprising to me is that this process has been the first time I've been a solo pastor, because this is a very small congregation in a very big building. The other piece is the other 2 disciple churches within a 5-mile radius of us in the last 12 months have either already sold and closed or have contracts to sell. And one of them has a 5-year die-in-place arrangement with a large adjacent congregation.
Yeah.
And so some of those folks have started coming over here as well. And so we've been in the business side of this. We've been in merger and acquisition language heavily during this last year. And on Monday and Tuesday of this week, if you've seen any national news, we were closed again because of a Houston utilities boiling water thing from the last big rain event. So we just try to be reactive in all of this.
Yeah. Which crisis are we going to be reacting to next? Well, and let me ask you this question from the vantage point of disciples of Christ. So so the whole mergers and acquisitions idea, this whole idea of, I mean, the COVID was a massive accelerant and of almost any trend line that was taking place. And if your church was already headed towards the exits got a whole lot closer, a whole lot faster during COVID.
Right.
And this is anecdotal more than it's scientific. On the mainline side of the Presbyterian spectrum, that whole mergers and acquisitions language, especially in maybe the West Coast, our West Coast friends may be more comfortable with that kind of language, but that kind of learning from a business model about how we deal with this kind of moment, are in Disciples of Christ life, is there a fear of that kind of mindset, or is it just, okay, it is what it is? Necessity is the mother of invention. And so we're going to have to figure out a way to respond regardless. How's that playing out in your tradition, Mike?
Yeah, Disciples from the 1800s has had a lot of mergers, a lot of divisions. Church of Christ a cappella church was one of the earliest split offs, along with some other kind of folks. We have 3 layers of church, and it's all covenantal. Local congregations own all of their own assets, but they're pretty big in having some connection. So many of them, when they're initially founded, say, if we were to ever go away, of course, those documents were written decades before anything like COVID, that they would enfold into either adjacent disciple churches or into areas and regions of the church. And so they're wired about that. Church unity is one of the polar stars of disciple ethos. And so as long as it's a part of the greater church, now, anyone in any denomination, they have some sentimental institutionalism about a local church, and if their parents or their grandparents did that. But there's something about wanting it to survive. And I think I resonate with a little bit of what Jessica said, in that even in this place, when churches blocks from us, sister churches are closing, there is something inside of many of the disciples who want to find a way to survive and go on, not just to keep the doors open, but to do meaningful things as disciples understand.
Yeah. All right. And, I'm on the audience's behalf, I'm asking the questions that are, kind of rising to the surface out of the narratives that you're going to hear today. But honestly, any one of these, we could probably spend just that question alone, the whole question of merger and acquisition and the legacy of closing congregations. We've talked about that before. We'll keep talking about that. Eileen, let's turn it to you from your vantage point and in the networks in which you operate. What's been the most surprising thing out of this past year that's really captured your attention?
Well, a year ago, I was sorting through the data from surveys and interviews with over 100 clergy and lay leaders. They came from 3 different cohorts. I had been talking with them for the better part of 18 months, and it was time to write the report. So this time last year, I was cranking, thinking I was going to turn that out by the time we got to March. And it was a ton of data. And I really didn't finish it until the summer, and then we presented it September 1st. But the thing is, all the issues we learned about in that research, they're all still on the table. There's nothing gone. It's all still here. And there's a couple of things I want to say about it. The big surprise to me was really coming to say to myself and other people, we're in a new era of ministry. Like, this is actually a new time. We can't talk about it like any other time we've lived in. And you all have been naming the characteristics of it in the ways that you've already been talking. And we'll say more about all of them. But the hybrid is not going away. It's here to stay. Even if you're in a tiny church that never meets on Zoom or anything, you're still influenced and impacted by hybrid. The loss of women in leadership is dramatic. The first year of COVID alone, 54 million women left their jobs globally. Wow. And those women were included in the church. Many women left. And so there's a setback there. We don't know what that's going to mean fully till later. That was kind of a surprise. I mean, I saw it happening. It was a surprise. I want to say a word about what a minute ago, Jessica mentioned exhaustion and isolation. And one of the fascinating things I experienced in going through the research I did with lay leaders and clergy is that isolation was more a common theme and concern among laity. pastors wouldn't have time in any time to be isolated. They were working double time, triple time. They're exhausted. So that distinction between the way lay people experienced the pandemic times and the all the ripple effects of that, and the way that clergy leaders and chaplains, who are also ministers and serving the church in a different, broader way, they're exhausted and they are on the verge, or if not completely burned out. Not all of them. There was also amazing resilience. And I don't want to skip over saying, wow, we are still here. And I interviewed people who were still serving at those times when I interviewed them. And so such a host of different things happening. And I could talk on and on through my list of things I learned. I hope that you'll look at the pandemic pastoring report, where I try to gather up those themes and say, these are urgent. And I think then I just want to say one other big word for me about what remains and doesn't seem to be going away because we're not addressing it, and that is grief. We are suffering with tremendous, clear and ambiguous grief. And churches have got to figure out how to respond to people and make space for processing that grief and acknowledging it collectively and individually. So I'll stop there with those. I could say more about any one of those topics and another list of half a dozen more.
Yeah, I probably won't be able to pull it. So I dropped the link to what Eileen's referencing into the chat feature. So if you don't have your chat up, look in that, and that gives you a way to connect immediately to what she's referencing. I probably don't have time to pull it in, but to Eileen's last point, Guy Sales, those of you who know Guy Sales, in Baptist circles, deeply respected, beloved, wise counsel and voice, has written recently on the church and lament as a practice, as to deal with this question of grief. And I cannot recommend it highly enough to kind of draw your attention to what he's talking about and writing about. So I think Eileen's exactly right as far as that's concerned.
Matt?
Yes. Please.
Yeah, I just want to plus right there on what Eileen said. With folks from two closed churches also worshiping here going into this Advent season, while there's rejoicing of church going on, they come with tremendous amounts of grief. Their 60, 70-year traditions and stuff aren't happening. They're in a different place. They've had to, we've worked together to bring some of their relics into this place. And Eileen, grief is a huge thing, irrespective of the COVID impact and all of that. One church that's now meeting with us had resources to pay their staff through the end of this year, but now that staff is going to be turned loose, and all that's happening. I cannot. I just want to amen that part of Eileen's work because we're neck deep in it right now.
I want to say one more word about it, which is words are not enough right now.
Yeah.
Lament is important, but it needs to be ritualized. We have got to find ways to ritualize our grief. We just keep trying to talk about it. People are like, la, 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 la. They don't want to talk about it, but they need to emotionally and ritually process it. And it's some of the most important work pastors and lay leaders and congregational ministers of all kinds can be doing right now. The work of ritualizing grief.
Yeah. And I would tag on that. Yeah. So the creative work that those of us in congregational ministry are having to do is not just give voice to it, but give structure to it. Like, how do we deal with, without being threatened by it, without feeling like people are weaponizing it against us? Because oftentimes that's the way I think that congregational ministers access it is, we're having to, our lay people are telling us we're having to turn loose of things that are meaningful to us, and we see that as blame, like if that's our fault somehow. And so the part of what Guy was talking about is how do we take that and how do we get out of a cycle where it becomes a win-lose kind of approach to this, but a shared exercise of a congregation naming as a family where we've been through this experience together. So yeah.
Amen.
So we're gonna go in a different direction with this next question. Well, I say we're gonna go in a different direction. I guess it depends on how y'all answer it. So what trend, Eileen, we'll come back to you with this one. What trend, moment, occurrence took place in 2022 that we're going to be talking about and responding to for the foreseeable future? And Eileen, I'm going to start with you.
Oh, you want to start with me now? I thought you
Yes.
were going to come back to me later, Matt.
No. We're gonna. So yeah, you get to go. This is kind of how we're gonna go. It's like we'll go back and forth like
Got
this.
it.
We'll answer
Right.
2 questions at a time. So
Yeah, there's so much I could say about, I think we're going to be dealing with all of it in the future. Like none of these things are going away. The level of crisis, we've had a COVID-19 pandemic. We also had the introduction for many white churches to how much chronic pandemic there has been for decades around race, class, economics, a lot of other things. And so those chronic pandemics are ongoing, and there's going to be more, just like the Houston story is perfect example of crises that are related to the environment and to healthcare that are ongoing. They're going to keep coming. We've got to think about how to do ministry in a way that we can move more quickly when those happen and not be caught as flat-footed as we were. We can't anticipate everything, but we need to be thinking about how are we caring for ourselves in the world in this work. So that's one. Two, I would say what I said earlier about women leaving the church, major setbacks. It's not just that the numbers are down and we've lost ground. Those of us who study, I study clergy women in the church as well. And it's that there's a wonderful study that came out. I didn't give you the link to this one, Matt, but it's called blah, blah, blah. Let me get it right in front of me. It's a project that actually studies how women do at work. They looked at 5,000 companies in 100 countries, and they figured out what was most needed during the time of pandemic in business was 2 characteristics. And those 2 characteristics were wisdom and compassion to get people through. And then they rated their leaders, all the leaders in these different corporations and businesses. And you're not going to be surprised to know that women scored really high on those 2 characteristics and men scored incredibly low on them. So when we take women out of the equation as leaders, we've lost wisdom and compassion, which we all know in church leadership is exactly what we need right now. Now, I can't blanket that on everybody, but you see the trend and the problem with that. We're going to be dealing with that problem for ages. It's going to continue to, and my part of my solution to that, and I've been studying ministry as a practice for 13 years. I'm a co-director for the Learning Pastoral Imagination Project. We've been a longitudinal study of ministry for 13 years now. And we've been trying to help people understand how ministry is learned in practice, not in your 3 years of seminary, but in a lifetime arc of learning. And the most important aspect of that learning, and what I think the church and the world need most right now, is ministry as a spiritual practice. And getting people to embrace that. We have to do mergers and acquisitions, but we also have to be present spiritually for the people in our congregations. And that takes a very intentional kind of presence that we're exhausted. And so people like Healthy Churches and other organizations need to be supporting ministers so that they can be practicing ministry as a spiritual practice, because that's what we need right now more than anything else.
Mike, what about you? What trend, moment, occurrence took place this past year that we're going to be talking about for a long time to come in your
Yep. All of what Eileen said, plus church institutionalism has got to become more nimble. We've with all of the different groups coming, because in disciples, much like other churches, my early life, I was Southern Baptist, but a lot of churches take on their own personalities and their own subsets of values inside of that. So often in our world, disciples across the theological continuum divvy themselves out. The folks who are coming in, and I don't want to use such corporate language, but those who now are forced to close who are coming, some of those are from very radical differences theological. A very conservative group who really at one point, when everyone was viable, didn't want to do much with the more progressive folks. Now all of those are in the same worship strata, and they're sitting around the same table. One of the 4 groups that's come in to be a part of our campus now is a Hispanic disciple church. And so there are language issues and all of that. One of the churches that's closed needs to keep their identity for a while as they finish dealing with their assets, but they want to be a part of determining the search process for the next called minister to where they'll be. We had to be nimble enough to modify just a couple of things in the bylaws to allow a singular exception for a few of them to be on the church search process, and they're not members of the church. That pushes against a lot of those old traditional boundaries. So in addition to all the spiritual and care piece of that, the institution and the organization has to be willing to look at itself differently. And what does the system and process need to be going forward?
Yeah, we're going to talk about fragmentation in a little bit, but it is fascinating to me that while American Christianity is fragmenting, at the same time, collaboration seems to be like an absolutely essential discipline in 21st century Christianity. And I'm trying to, I can't figure out how those two, I get why both of them are happening at the same time, but it's the relationship between those two phenomena that I'm still working with a little bit.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's where we are. That's the headwaters of where we are.
Yeah. Jessica, what about you? What happened in 2022? Event, moment, occurrence that you think we're going to be talking about for a long time to come?
Yeah, I think I don't have much to add here other than to just underscore again the burnout among leaders at a time when we desperately need really good leadership. And I think what I'm observing in my colleagues right now is the knowing what is needed, or at least knowing a lot is needed from us and just not having the oomph to give it. And so also that sort of that dissonance within ourselves of I see what's needed of me and I don't have it. And that is a recipe for burnout right there.
And is it leading to, there was already a trend before the pandemic of less people in congregational ministry. That's not a new trend, but in Presbyterian spaces, has that become a massive increase in the last 2 to 3 years in your experience, Jessica? Is burnout translating, in other words, into resignations?
Yeah, I have heard, I have not seen the actual data, but I've heard that we have a huge clergy shortage that has been predicted for a long time that now has arrived. I haven't actually seen those numbers as yet, but and then I can say anecdotally for like a group of 20 pastors that I'm in, when we met this year for the first time in several years in person, the number of people who were thinking about, I'm going to go back to school and get a counseling degree, or like, I'm going to find some church adjacent ministry that I might think about stepping into. I was really surprised by the number of my close colleagues.
Can I add one other sort of trend that's related to what Jessica's saying right now? Yeah. And that is, every time I've presented about the pandemic pastoring report, somebody raises their hand or 2 or 3 people and say, what about bivocational ministry? And I've been given that more thought and thinking about what that means. One of the things I think that's interesting about what that means right now, it's been meaning it's not a brand new idea, but I see it coming. It's my thinking toward the future about this. It's not just that people will do what Jessica was suggesting, a whole different kind of adjacent thing like counseling or coaching or one of those things, but also people are going to increasingly do what the Methodists have been doing for ages, right? Have a multi-point charge. Like they're going to do bivocational at 2 or 3 ministries. They're going to have multiple ministry roles, not ministry used car sales, which is like the old negative way we think about bivocational ministry. Yeah. So I just want to point that out, that I think there is an expansion as churches have a little less capital to put into paying pastors and other staff, part-time staff. They are going to expand how many different ministry jobs they do. And I just think that's going to be what bivocational looks like increasingly. But I could turn out to be wrong. Y'all can ask me in a few years how that turned out to be.
Well, and I'll put you, my friend and colleague, Deborah Wright, is on with us today. And Deborah's actually done some work along those lines. And so Eileen, remind me to connect you with Deborah Wright, who's in that exploration journey as we speak, in some ways, talking about how churches are reformulating the idea. So anyway.
And Matt, we're seeing in Disciple, because I've done committee on ministry work for the Southwest region, which is basically Texas and New Mexico, our largest area that traditionally has cranked out the most clergy through seminary process. Seminary enrollments are down for us. folks are seeing the call into ministry as less viable. They don't know if they can take care of their families about that. Fewer of the congregations in the disciples are large enough to support full-time. And so it's hurting all the way up to the seminary levels.
Yeah. Yep. The ATS numbers they took a massive hit in the aftermath of the Great Recession. They've rebounded a little bit, but the overall numbers in seminary are not corresponding to the overall numbers in congregational ministry. Those numbers went down and have stayed down. So it is having a massive impact.
You'll see some news, Matt, out there about increased numbers in ATS schools. And it's true if you look at the whole top numbers, but those numbers are almost exclusively in evangelical seminaries, the increases. Mainlines continue to decline. Catholic continues to decline. That it's really important to understand those three traditions are different when you look at ATS numbers. And I've looked at them lately, and I was excited at first. I was like, wow, they're up. How's that? My own school's done fairly steady. We've stayed fairly steady. But a lot of mainline schools took a dive in these last 2 years in enrollments. So the impact is not what the recession was down. There was slight increase. We're back down.
And even in the evangelical spaces, I think, Eileen, a lot of that increase is in undergraduate degrees,
and how they count,
not in seminary degrees. So
and
we're
how they count
a number we weren't tracking a generation ago.
Yeah, that's right. That is a part of the picture. You're exactly right.
Yeah. So we've already touched on COVID a fair amount, but I want to give the three of you an opportunity to kind of put the spotlights kind of squarely on it in your perspective. And Jessica, we'll start with you. You started us off hopefully, so we can be hopeful today. It is okay. It's been a hard year. It's been an exhausting year, but by all means, let's give ourselves permission to be hopeful if we want to. I mean, the question is, we all thought a year ago COVID was going to go all the way into our rearview mirror, and it didn't. We're still experiencing it. The numbers are high at the moment. They're not. The hospitalizations aren't high. But I don't just want to talk about the medical impact. In fact, I don't even really want to talk about the medical impact at all. I really want to talk about the congregational impact. You know, what do we think the long tail of COVID is going to be? And do we think it will hasten the demise of smaller congregations? Or, as Jessica kind of reminded us as we started, maybe we're all more resilient than we thought we were when this is going on. So Jessica, I'll start with you, and then Mike, and then Eileen, I'll come back to you. So what do you think, Jessica?
My hope, and I think we're seeing this at least anecdotally, is the incredible creativity that this has required of churches. We've risen to the challenge in many, many cases, and we didn't know we could. So I hope that creativity continues. And I think alongside that, I think some of what we saw was a stripping away of stuff that really didn't matter, that were trappings that we put around church that didn't ultimately matter to us. And so paying more attention as congregations, as communities of faith, to what are the real questions and struggles of faithful life that people are bringing, and how do we nurture those? To the extent we're doing that, I hope that will be the long tail for us in the church.
Mike, what about you?
Yeah, it is so complex for the contextual points that I said in my opening remarks about university across the street, medical center 4 blocks away, and the people impacted by that. Disciples are very table-centric, communion every week, universality of that. And we can't come back yet to the way it used to be. Many of our more progressive churches were doing communion by intinction, and we're not there yet. And so we want to say we get over these things, and then the most physical and intimate piece that we do, COVID and all other health issues are still standing there. And it's a big deal, and it's a big cloud. I mean, people will come and then leave and say, I didn't feel like I had worship today, because we're still using all of those individual cup kind of things, and it's affecting them spiritually. And preachers, we don't have a fix to that. It's a real struggle. Now, 3 or 4 churches coming together on this campus. What does Christmas Eve look like? Do you think we'll be at that place? And rather than being able to talk about it theologically, they have all of this medical or phobia still about not wanting to restart a site of infection. And so the conversation is there, and it's paralyzing part of the congregational life in this moment. It's really hard.
Yeah. Eileen, what about you?
Gosh, there's so much I want to say, but let me focus on a couple of things. It was really so helpful to have a third of these people I interviewed and surveyed to be lay leaders, because the contrast between what they experienced and what clergy leaders experienced helps us see each more clearly. And one of the things to say about the long tail is that I heard stories over and over from lay leaders and really from pastors even more about how lockdown and the totally distant church, Zoom, YouTube, Facebook, whatever, that moment, that long moment for many churches created a real crisis of what do lay leaders do in our church, because the pastors took all of it right here and they did it. And they did it not because they felt important or like they were superheroes, but because they didn't want to put their church lay leaders in harm's way. They didn't want to make people sick who might die. And in the first year, that was a real thing. I mean, people were dying of COVID and we had no way to stop it and no vaccine and barely even tests until, right? So that long moment of pulling back by volunteers through no fault of anyone, just the pandemic itself, it meant that the reconnection took a whole lot of different forms. We're still trying to figure out what that means. How do we work together? So your collaboration question earlier, I think, is essential. We need to be exploring every way to collaborate between lay leaders and clergy, as well as among churches and denominational groups, et cetera. Another thing that I think will be the long tail has to do with just how we're going to move quickly. Y'all have already talked about that. Like, can't get stuck in this, oh gosh, we've got to have a certain kind of process for decision making. Our decision making processes have got to change. They are changing. And I like to just sum up like one of the things that needs to happen in this way. This is just Eileen's anecdotal talk here. And it's from doing a process of 2 years, which we call gather around the table before COVID happened and reevaluate everything. Just suspend the bylaws. There's a vote you can take at your church called suspend the bylaws. And you figure out what's working by suspending the bylaws and doing it. And then once you know it's working, then you encode it in the bylaws instead of the reverse, which we've done from, the 1950s. So finding ways to move more quickly. We had to do it. We can keep doing it. The other thing I want to say, and then I'll stop, is going into before the pandemic, before March of 2020, my church, among many others, would have said, we are never going to have online church. That is anathema. That is awful. We can't connect. We can't be together. We can't have communion. We had all the reasons we weren't going to do that. Guess what? By the end of March, we were doing it. And as were thousands of other churches. Yeah. We have to get over this divide of thinking in-person is good and digital is bad. That has to end, because they are both good and they both have downsides. And the difference, the real honest difference, is not that digital is bad, but that it's new. We don't really know how to do it very well yet. And I've been teaching online for a long time, and I know you can get better at it. You can create meaningful space like this. It doesn't feel better right now, because for thousands of years, we knew how to be together with other bodies in the same room, doing things that we don't even have to think about because they are known by body. And I say one of the greatest losses we had during COVID was knowing how to move our bodies through space again, because we got isolated from each other and we weren't together for worship and meetings and gatherings of food, et cetera. And so we have to learn all that again. And it can be very exciting and very invigorating to figure out how to make very meaningful spaces in new places. And so I want to really urge people to get past that divide. Hybrid's here to stay. Let's figure out how to make this part of what we do good and better for what it is, and not constantly lamenting is important, but not constantly leaving it out with lament that this is somehow less or bad. It's neither. It's different. And we can learn to do it a lot better.
So I'm looking at the rest of the list of questions that I sent you and realizing we don't have time to get through all of them. So I'm going to choose a little bit, pick and choose here a little bit from the kind of the meatier questions. I want to ask one more substantive question and then one maybe a little bit more hopeful question. I want to talk a little bit about around a lot of energy. There's a tremendous amount of energy in 2022 around the question of women's roles in the church, at least in part, not completely, but at least in part, because of Kristen Cobbs Dumais' book, Jesus and John Wayne, and Beth Barr's book about biblical womanhood. What did you notice from your vantage point about that conversation? And what do you, all this energy of the moment, and then we're adding to it, Eileen, and I'm going to start with you, the pandemic's impact on women, or at least the impact of, well, probably it's the pandemic. The step back is probably something we can directly trace to women. So what do we do with all that? All this energy, but also this step back. What do we make of all that collectively? Eileen, let's start with you.
Well, patriarchy's still here and doing its work. Let's just say that, because it cuts across everything you just said and a whole lot more. And it gives us a chance to see it revealed, like it's a revelatory time. It revealed where some inequities had been kind of hidden. Oh, look at all the women who are leading the church now. Well, in fact, they're leading for less pay. They're leading with less movability. They're leading with less status. And so this revealed it. And also that we continue to burden women, people identify as women, as the primary caregivers for our young people, for our children, for our infants. And when we do that, it means the first thing that goes is their work, and they step back from it. Of course, I have stories of men who, as parents, did not feel supported during COVID either, and as parents had to step away from their jobs. So it's not a universally women's problem, but it is. The other, much more unpleasant and difficult and painful thing to talk about is Me Too and Church Too. And 2022 is a big year. Yeah. For Church Too and Me Too. And I was on things at being interviewed about Southern Baptists because I know about them, having grown up that way, not being Southern Baptist now, and having written a book about Southern Baptist clergy women. And the Me Too and Church Too problem feels like, I think, to the average church that's just trying to get back on their feet after 2 years of pandemic life, feels like, oh my God, could we not talk about one more difficult thing? And yet, it was a big story. It hit a lot of headlines in 22. And what it means is there are hundreds and thousands of survivors who are finding the courage to step forward and say, this is what happened to me, either in my church, or my church didn't support me, or it was my pastor. And we as churches need to step up and be ready to have safer. There's a relative safety. There's never perfect safety in churches. And we need to be able to have a public voice. And we need to believe survivors. Those are just so basic, and yet they need to be said over and over again. Yes, I have a workshop that we put together in 21. It turned out to be prescient for 22, especially among Southern Baptists and, of course, Roman Catholics ongoing. Every denomination this year had a complaint somewhere in a public address to this issue.
Yeah. Mike, what about for you and your vantage point?
Well, disciples are not immune from some of those same inequities in terms of women in ministry. However, we have a long history of leading in that area. Our current general minister and president and the previous general minister and president were both female clergy. Several of the denominational leadership are female clergy, and in many different places. And our whole national search model is very intentional about bringing those places together. Seminaries are there, several feminist movement things. One of the 3 churches who closed into this, the one that's paying staff through the end of the year, their senior pastor was woman clergy, who might very well be a candidate for this position moving forward. And so my oldest daughter is ordained disciple clergy as well. And so I've worked with quite a few in that world. That being said, Disciples are also independent at the congregational level, and many times, and will have those same abuses of women in leadership. The lay leadership that was in place here in Houston when I came was all women. Well, except that the elder chair at the current moment is male. Board chair elect, treasurer elect, secretary, those are all women who have professional lives outside of this. And so they were nimble, they're comfortable in the Zoom world or in the office platform world, and they continue to have excellent meetings during that piece. So we resonate, but we do have a few pockets of a little more success in women in leadership and in ministry than some places. But we're going to continue to work on that.
Jessica, what about you?
Yeah, I think I would say where I'm seeing the energy going forward, or where I hope the energy will go going forward, is I think it's directly tied to some of the polarization and fragmentation of the country that we're seeing. And so my fear is that we're going to just continue to polarize and fragmentize ourselves, such that some of us are really working very hard on some of these issues of Christian nationalism and patriarchy and racism, and others are on the other end of that spectrum. So I think my hope is that we can find ways as the church, where we have at least historically been one of the places that cuts across a lot of those different areas of society, that we can continue to play that role and really invite self-reflection, invite forward movement. And I've been really helped recently by the new book that just came out, The Persuaders by Anand Giridharadas. And he talks about, one of the people he quotes in it, and I'm not remembering who the quote is to, but, or he's talking about some of the women that he interviewed for the book, that he talks about, they stand very bravely in their truth of what they believe, and they reach out at the same time. So they're creating a movement of millions rather than of hundreds, moving in the direction toward justice and community. And I want to claim that for the church's call right now too. How do we stand bravely in the truth of what we believe and reach out? Because otherwise we're just going to have preaching to the choir around these issues, and that's not ultimately what we need. That's not what the kingdom calls us to.
Yeah, yes and has become kind of a cliche phrase in some ways, but this is very much a yes and kind of like, yes, this is what I believe, and I want to stay in relationship with you. And I'm doing some work around polarization, and a man named Jonathan Haidt talks about how when we back up on pluralism, his phrase is, it makes us stupid. We aren't in conversation with people, and we rob ourselves of the opportunity for change to come about as a result. I love that. I'm going to look up Persuaders and add that to my reading list. Thank you for that recommendation. So let's end this way. We're already over time by several minutes, but if I said in 30 seconds or less, all three of you, Jessica, we'll start with you. Something that blessed you. We're going to end with a note of hope. Something that blessed you in 2022 related to the church. What would that be?
Being able to connect with colleagues in the flesh again. I think that's where just the loneliness of, we all took on more work and we did it largely from our kitchens. And so to be able to be in person and hear remarkable stories of what people have been doing over the last 3 years, and be reminded of why we do this work together.
Mike, what about you?
I think what has blessed me is all four of these congregations that are now here and talking to one another had every reason to say, we quit. I'm gone. I don't want to lead anymore. I just want to sit in the back row and not do anything. And they don't want to quit. And the other piece that I want to say that's blessed me is this book by Don Weeks, Joe and Don Weeks, our co-pastor, husband and wife at First Christian Church in Odessa. They were there while I was in Midland, 20 miles away. Had a huge shell of a First Christian Church in downtown adjacent to First Baptist that back during the big oil days had built this huge campus. It was a shell of itself. They sold lock, stock, and barrel to First Baptist, moved across town, changed the name of the church, reinvented themselves, brought people in. If you want a positive story of how to overcome this from the progressive mainline church. I cannot commend them. And Matt, Dawn is someone that you need to talk to and get her on some of these in the future, because the theology and the practical there, and to be a tiny part of nearby with that continues to bless me.
Absolutely. That's good. That's a great suggestion. Thanks, Mike. Eileen, you get the last word today. What's something that has blessed you in this year?
Interviewing all those ministers and lay leaders just reminded me over and over again that the church is the most enduring and resilient institution we have. There are bigger, stronger ones, but they don't hold the whole life cycle together. Churches hold everybody. There's room for birth to death, and we become a community in a way that nothing in our lifetimes lasts longer than church. And when I asked lay leaders, what did you need your pastor to know during the pandemic? I can't tell you how many of them I could if I'd go and count. Lots of them said, I needed my pastor to know how much I support her, how much I have his back. I support him 200%. And that was a very encouraging word, not because pastors need glorification, but because lay leaders are here for it. They want to be part of the whole picture, and they're underutilized in our collaborations for how to sustain and move the church forward. And I was very encouraged and blessed by that response to that interview question.
So I think I can probably speak for everybody to say, like, we drank from a really delicious fire hose today. Like we covered a lot, and all three of these individuals and we just scratched the surface in terms of the wisdom and insight and expertise of these three very gifted ministers. So thank you to the three of you for jumping on the roller coaster and taking a lightning ride through all these topics. Today, we've looked back into 2022. Next week, we're going to look forward. Today was analysis. Next week is prognostication in some ways. Another all-star panel will join us. I hope you return and are part of that conversation next week with a different panel as we kind of wrap up the year and as we look forward. I hope you all have a great week and hope to see you next week. Thanks, everyone.